Hello, everyone. This is Sean from the Soccer Nostalgia blog. I have the pleasure to interview Irish freelance writer, historian, and broadcaster Mr. John O'Carroll. Mr. O'Carroll has appeared multiple times on the podcast discussing the history of the Republic of Ireland national team. This interview is separate from a podcast series. This video interview will serve as a companion piece to a written blog presentation on the head-to-head encounters between Republic of Ireland and France. Hello, John. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise, Shahan. Always a pleasure as well.
Let's dive into the match history between the Republic of Ireland and France. The nations met for the first time in a friendly in Paris on May 23rd, 1937. The Republic of Ireland won this match 2-0. This would be the only away win for the Republic of Ireland in this series. But I imagine no one from either side probably remembers this insignificant friendly.
That would be absolutely correct, Shahan. And you mentioned there about that being the only Republic of Ireland away win. Of course, many would argue that the 2009 game in Paris should have been an away win as well. But we'll come to that later in the
Yeah.
podcast. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yeah. This 1937 game, yeah. Also in 1937, this was the year that they no longer used the name Football Association of the Irish Free State. So they just used the term Ireland. And then, of course, in 1949, of course, when they officially became a republic, it was in 1949 onwards they used the moniker Republic of Ireland. This 1937 game, as you say, yeah, first friendly between them. Little or no newspaper reports of it to hand and no video footage. So can't really comment too much on the game itself, except it was obviously an erstwhile exercise for Ireland. They won the game 2-0. There was one player on the team, the Irish team, that I think is worth discussing here, and that was their goalkeeper, Tommy Breen. Now, at this time, Shahan, as you know, Ireland and Northern Ireland, they could both pick from the same pool of players if they so wished. Because, as I said, the Republic hadn't come into being, and the practice of both Irelands selecting the same players, as it were, only ceased in 1950. So, up to 1950, both the Republic and Northern Ireland could pick from the same pool of players. So, there were several instances in those years of players having dual internationality, if that makes sense. A number of players would have played both for Ireland and for Northern Ireland. So, the goalkeeper, anyway, Tommy Breen, as I mentioned, he was the goalkeeper for Ireland in 1937 in this game. Now, he won 5 caps for Ireland, and he also won 9 for Northern Ireland. Now, 6 days before this game against France, he had made his debut in another friendly, which was a 1-0 victory against Switzerland. And then, of course, 6 days later, he played in this game against France. And Tommy became the first goalkeeper to keep 2 consecutive clean sheets on an Irish international team. Now, he was again selected by the FAI to face Norway the following October in a World Cup qualifier. But instead, he withdrew from the Ireland team and instead he chose to play for Northern Ireland in their game against England later in that month. And of course, the FAI, the Football Association of Ireland, that would have controlled soccer in what's now the Republic, of course, were not best pleased with this. So the FAI basically suspended Tommy until after World War II. So after World War II, of course, when playing soccer and domestic seasons got back to some level of normality, he was with Manchester United by now. And Linfield, anyway, in Northern Ireland, they were interested in signing him, but they were unwilling to meet Manchester United's valuation of him at this time, which was £1,000. So, with no club to go to, Tommy Breen came back to Dublin and he signed for League of Ireland club Shamrock Rovers. And because of this, he was eligible once again to play for the Republic of Ireland, and he won 3 further caps against England in 1946 and also the following year against both Spain and Portugal. So Tommy, he was a native of Drogheda, and as you can see, he had quite a storied international career. And I think actually prior to the Second World War, I think he may have spent time playing for Liverpool also. So he would have been one of these, I suppose, a small number of players who would have played for both Liverpool and Manchester United. He would have been kind of, I suppose, the most, I suppose, high-profile player on this 1937 Republic team.
And as far as the French, there are some familiar faces: Raoul Diagne, Edmond Delfour, Roger Courtois, and Alfred Aston, among others.
Of course, France would have been playing friendlies all through 1937, in preparation for the World Cup, which they were hosting the following year.
It would take more than a decade. Of course, there was the war in between, but the next time the nations would meet would be in the decade of the 1950s. They would meet one another on three occasions in this decade. So the first one was on November 16th, 1952 at Dublin. This was the first match on Irish soil. This match ended as a 1-1 tie. The famous French defender Robert Jonquet scored an own goal for the Irish, and Roger Piantoni, another famous player from the 1958 squad, scored a France's goal. For the French, you have Roger March. We mentioned Jonquet, Raymond Coppa, Ballon d'Or winner, 1958, and Roger Piantoni that we mentioned.
What was significant about this game was that for the first time, and I believe the only time to date, on the Irish 11, you had three players from Limerick, which would be my own town, so to speak. You had Tom
Sean
Ahern,
Cusack, yeah.
yes, and Johnny Gavin, who was with Norwich City. Now, there was one amusing incident during this game, wasn't there? Where one of the French players, I think it could have been either Copa or Piantoni, I'm not too sure which one, but at one stage anyway in the game, they tackled Tom Ahern quite badly. And Tom took exception to the tackle. And basically, anyway, he jumped up, jumped quickly to his feet, and started chasing the French player in question. So you had the amusing side of the French player virtually running around the pitch like a hare with Tom Ahern in hot pursuit of him. You know? And amazingly, the referee took no action, I believe. Of course, in those days, Shahanas, kind of challenges, shall we say, for the most part, were a bit more meaty than they are today, shall we say.
For sure. The next matches during this decade were as part of the 1954 World Cup qualifiers. They would meet one another in many, many more World Cup qualifiers through the following decades. The first one was again at Dublin on October 4th, 1953. France won this match 5-3. This was the first away win for the French in the series. So you have David Walsh scoring twice, one on a penalty kick, and Frank O'Farrell scoring another. And for the French, you have Glovaki, Penver, Ujlaki scoring twice, and Flamion scoring another.
Frank O'Farrell, who later managed both Leicester City and Manchester United.
Yes, yes. And in fact, the Iran national team as well.
Yes, that's
Yes.
right.
Yeah.
Mm.
Some of the familiar names we have Con Martin of Aston Villa. For the French, we have again Roger March, Jonquet, many of the Stade Reims players, the famous French team of the decade, Coppa, Piantoni. France would qualify from this group from the World Cup. And the next match on November 25th, 1953, was in Paris at Parc des Princes. This one, the French won this match 1-0. Piantoni scoring the winner. France qualified to the World Cup.
The one interesting thing I noticed about these three games, Shahan, even though, again, as I said, that we're only relying on newspaper reports, was that if you compare the 1952 lineout, the Irish lineout, with the lineout that began the game the following year in Paris, there was only 4 survivors. So in the space of 12 months, I mean, there were 7 changes on the Irish team. So that possibly could suggest that maybe at that time, there was players were coming and going and that there was a large turnover of players, shall we say. And maybe, well, of course, there was no such thing as a standalone manager of the team at this stage. So maybe there was a lot of chopping and change. I suppose the
Right,
selection
there was a
committee.
technical commission. Yeah.
There was it. Now, there was a Scottish coach. He was Doug Livingstone. But he was really only a coach. I'm not sure did he have any selectorial powers, as it were. in that the team were actually picked by a committee of 5, which would have been drawn from the leading clubs in the League of Ireland. But as I say, 7 changes in the space of a year would suggest to me that, either the selection committee were kind of, I suppose, maybe the team was in transition, or maybe they were just casting the net far and wide in the search for players. And then, of course, as well, Shahan, as you know, Ireland may have been out of contention for qualification in 1953 by the time the game in Paris rolled around. So maybe some players, for whatever reason or other, may not have, made themselves available. Because we did see that, particularly in the 70s, where if I coming up maybe to the concluding stages of a World Cup qualification campaign, if Ireland were out of contention maybe with a game or two to go, some players obviously, either they wouldn't have been released from their clubs or they wouldn't have made themselves available for selection, basically. The one thing I notice in general about these games is that anytime we played France, we seemed to kind of play them often or frequently in a short period, and then there tended to be a long gap until the next
Right.
game again. Yeah. We might play them maybe 2 or 3 times, maybe in the space maybe of 18 months or 2 years, and then there could be a gap of several years or more before the next meeting.
The next meeting would be another 2 decades. So in the 1970s, the size would again be in both World Cup qualifying groups for 1974 and 1978. So let's take a look at the 1974 World Cup qualifiers. For the first one, on November 15th, 1972, at Dublin, the Irish defeated France 2-1. And this was the first official victory of the Irish over France at Dublin at Delimont Park. Terry Conroy and Ray Tracy scored. For the French, Jean-Michel Lacquet scored. Players, you have John Giles, Joe Kinnear, in goal, Alan Kelly, whose son would also become an international goalkeeper for Ireland. And for the French, you have Marius Trésor and Jean-Michel Lacquet, we mentioned, Georges Beretta and Hervé Ravelli.
I think it's fair to say as well that France would have been in maybe transition at this stage.
Yes.
Because, they'd qualified for the 1966 World Cup, but they didn't qualify again until 1978. So they were going through something of a fallow period at this time. As regards Ireland, I think it was only kind of by 1972 that they were sort of taking the first steps towards a gradual improvement at international level. John Giles, of course, who was a key figure in the Ireland team at this time, he recalled in his autobiography years later that in 1972, Liam Toohey was manager, and it was he who brought the Irish team on a great deal. And of course, funnily enough, at the end, of course, Ireland would have finished their World Cup qualification campaign, shall we say, in the early summer of 1973. So John Giles would have succeeded Liam Toohey as manager. But John said anyway that at this time it was a big thing for Ireland to beat France, because although they were in transition, they were still a strong enough team. Let's not forget. And it was the beginning of a period when Irish supporters came to Delimont Park. And, there was almost, I suppose, there was a gradual expectation growing that, Ireland would achieve good results. But as I say, Liam Toohey was instrumental in that, because, as I said in one of my first podcasts on the history of the Republic of Ireland team, up to 1971 or so, for some reason, many of the international matches of the Republic were actually played on Sunday afternoons. And of course, as you know, this caused its own problems in that most, if not all, of the players would have been playing English League games the previous day. And it seems why the FAI favoured playing matches on Sunday afternoons was in order to maximise gate receipts and maximise attendances. Because I believe, now I'm open to correction on this, but I believe that Delimont Park was the first soccer ground in the Republic to have floodlights installed. And they were only installed, I believe, in the mid-1960s. So up to then, of course, unless, of course, matches were being played at the end of a season, certainly for most of the season, it was impossible to play matches at night due to the lack of floodlights. So matches, in some cases, end up being played on Sunday afternoons. And that may have been a factor as well in Ireland's poor results up to the 1970s. But yeah, Liam, anyway, when he took over, where possible, he managed to get the internationals scheduled in midweek. kind of more or less in sync, say, with what the other nations like England and Scotland and so on were doing. So, yeah, this game against France, Ireland had played their opening World Cup qualifier against the Soviet Union the previous month in October in Lansdowne Road. They'd lost that game 2-1. So this game against France was really a game they had to win in order to remain in contention for the qualification. Because, I mean, you had 3 teams in the group and only one qualified. Or one maybe would have gone into a playoff to qualify. So qualification was difficult. But now, it might seem like much now, but that 1972 win over France Jahan, this was a very significant win for the Irish team. Because this was, believe it or not, our first competitive win in 5 years. You have to go back to a game away to Czechoslovakia in late 1967 for what would have been our last competitive qualifying win. And actually, that win over Czechoslovakia in 1967 allowed Spain to qualify for the 1968 European Championship. In the previous World Cup qualifying campaign, which would have been the qualifying campaign for the 1970 World Cup, Ireland had drawn 1 game and they'd lost 5 out of 6 and they'd only scored 3 goals. Mick Meegan then, of course, had been in charge and results were very poor under him. So in 1971, he'd been replaced by Liam Toohey. So by the time 1972 came around, there was the signs there that maybe there was finally some decent talent coming through because for that game against France, I mean, in midfield, you had John Giles, you had Owen Hand, who was going to be the future international manager, of course, Tony Byrne of Southampton, Joe Kinnear, Tottenham Hotspur, and of course, up front then you had Don Givens, who was making a name for himself at this stage with Queen's Park Rangers, Terry Conroy of Stoke, and of course another player who didn't feature in this game, Steve Highway of Liverpool. So by this stage, there was material there for Liam Toohey and subsequently John Giles to work with. And of course, in the years that followed, of course, there was more material to come on stream.
The return leg was on May 19th, 1973 at Paris, and this match ended as a 1-1 tie. Serge Chiesa had given France the lead in the 78th minute, but Mick Martin tied the match in the 83rd minute. Both teams were eliminated in the end.
This was notable as well, Shahan, in that I believe it could have been one of the first Irish international games that was actually televised live in Ireland, which was a big thing at the time. And the entire game is available on YouTube, fortunately enough. So we can actually get to see this game. And the other takeaway from this game was that Ireland fielded without their 2, shall we say, most high-profile players, namely John Giles and Steve Highway, for this game. Because the likes of John Giles and Steve Highway, if they played in these games, they would have an extremely busy schedule because, as you know, Leeds, they had been pushing for the league title, of course, and they also reached both the FA Cup final and the European Cup Winners' Cup final. So by the time May would have rolled around, they would have had maybe quite a number of games to get through. Likewise with Liverpool, they had just won the league title in England and they were also in the UEFA Cup final, which in those days, as you know, was a 2-legged affair. So the Sunday prior to this game against France was played on the 19th of May, which was a Saturday evening. The previous Sunday, Ireland had lost in Moscow, and that eliminated Ireland. And of course, as it turned out, this draw was to more or less eliminate France as well. And as I say, Ireland fielded without John Giles and Steve Highway in that John Giles had featured the previous Wednesday in the Cup Winners' Cup final for Leeds against AC Milan, and he picked up a knock in that game, or he was carrying a knock into that game, so he didn't feature. And Steve Highway then, Liverpool was still involved in the 2-leg UEFA Cup final. And the second leg of that UEFA Cup final was due to be played the Wednesday after this France-Ireland game. That was the reason why Giles and Highway did not feature. But yeah, it was a notable result for the Republic, and I suppose the fact that it was televised live brought the game, I suppose, to a new audience in Ireland. And as you know, televised live games were few and far between in those days. So it would have raised, the awareness of what the Republic of Ireland team were actually beginning to achieve at this particular point in time. But yes, a notable result, even though it was away from home. So I suppose that World Cup qualifying campaign was really where we saw the Republic of Ireland taking the first steps towards finally improving their standard in international soccer.
The teams are also in the next World Cup qualifying group for 1978. So again, it was a three-team group with France, Republic of Ireland, and Bulgaria. By this time, France are going through renaissance. They have appointed Michel Hidalgo as manager, and you have players coming through like Michel Platini, Dominic Rocheteau, Didier Six, Maxime Bossis, among others, who in a few years' time would reach the semifinal of a World Cup, actually two World Cups, and win the 1984 Euros. As far as the Irish, you have other familiar names around this time. David O'Leary of Arsenal breaking through, Jerry Daly, John Giles is still around as player manager. Liam Brady is breaking through at Arsenal. Others like Steve Highway at Liverpool and Don Givens at Queen's Park Rangers. Another young player, Frank Stapleton of Arsenal, again breaking through. So there's some players who are more familiar, I guess, to our generation, who are breaking out at the international level around this time. The first leg is on November 17th, 1976 at Paris at Parc des Princes. France wins this match 2-0. Michel Platini scores in the 47th minute, and Dominique Batnay scores in the 88th minute. However, there's some controversy when Frank Stapleton scores a goal in the 57th minute that was ruled out for offside. Second leg at Dublin on March 30th, 1977, on a windy day. At Dublin at Lansdowne Road, it's the Irish that come away victorious with Liam Brady scoring in the 11th minute. They cancel each other out, but France has a better record against Bulgaria, and they're the team that qualified to the 1978 World Cup.
Yeah, absolutely, Shahan. Well, of course, subsequent years were to show this, but if we can just return for a moment to the 1976 game in Paris, unfortunately, this was to be the first of, shall we say, maybe a number of controversial incidents that were to be part and parcel of France-Ireland games in some of the years that followed. In that, as you mentioned, Frank Stapleton had a perfectly good goal disallowed in this particular game. And to this day, anyway, John Giles, who was player manager at this stage, and I suppose indeed a lot of people that were looking at the game, it's very hard to understand why this particular goal was disallowed. And I mean, if this goal had been allowed, I mean, who knows what way the trajectory of the game would have gone. But the thing about it was, and John Giles said this in his autobiography, he had been kind of worrying about this sort of thing happening because the previous month, and I know, I think we may have touched on this briefly in an earlier podcast, France had played Bulgaria in Sofia, and France themselves had had a perfectly legitimate goal disallowed. And I think it resulted famously in a French commentator
Oh, yes,
calling
yes.
an expletive, as it were.
Thierry Roland, the famous commentator, yeah.
Yes, yes. But as I say, Frank Stapleton had a goal disallowed, I should say. Unfortunately, it was to be a recurring team. And then later in the game, I think David O'Leary was clearing a ball down the line, and Bernard Lacombe came in with a heavy tackle. And in actual fact, David O'Leary could have suffered a broken leg quite easily. Lacombe was booked, but I think, in all fairness, it really should have been a red card at that stage because it was quite a dangerous tackle. But the goals themselves, anyway, this game, anyway, is available in its entirety on YouTube, thankfully. And the first French goal, which was the breakthrough for them, was an uncharacteristic mistake from John Giles. He was in, shall we say, a central defensive position, attempting to play the ball out from the back, received the ball from a throw from the goalkeeper, Alan Kelly. And I suppose it was one of the very rare mistakes John Giles made in an Irish jersey. He attempted to play a pass which was intercepted, and Michel Platini scored the opening goal from it. So, yeah, you see, France they were very much an up-and-coming team at this particular stage, as you know. I mean, you had Michel Platini and Dominic Rocheteau and several other players that were to become renowned in later years. they were breaking through at this stage, because at this time they had put a lot of work into developing young players, and it was beginning to bear fruit for them. But it was an unfortunate defeat, and as you mentioned, by now there was, shall we say, maybe the first maybe golden generation of Irish players starting to come through, because Ireland had just barely missed out on qualifying for the 1976 Euros. And because of that, then there was expectation around the team was starting to increase. And for the first time in many years, people began to believe that maybe if things were to go right for us, we may have a genuine chance of actually making the breakthrough at international level and qualifying for major tournaments. So yeah, as you mentioned, I mean, there was the three Arsenal youngsters at this stage, David O'Leary, Liam Brady, and Frank Stapleton, of course, and John Giles and Steve Highway, of course, which we mentioned as well. But, of course, France too were on an upward trajectory, because in addition to the young players coming through, Saint Etienne had reached the European Cup final the previous May. So French club soccer was, beginning to emerge as well from the doldrums. As we all know, Michel Platini was breaking through at this stage as well. He played quite well in the game in Paris, but he had a quite enough game in the return game in Dublin, as it turned out. And the return game then the following March in Dublin, Liam Brady scored after 11 minutes, and it was really a goal of Liam Brady's own making, because again, this game is available on YouTube, and you can really see kind of, I suppose, maybe one of the early signs of the great player Liam Brady was to become, in that he created a chance almost virtually out of nothing by himself and scored the goal from it. Now, in this game, Ireland did play some good soccer, although towards the end, I suppose maybe with the prospect of a victory there, they began to get a little bit nervous. So they tended to fall back a little bit. But that often happens, when teams have a one-goal lead and when they're playing against what is perceived to be superior opposition. So after this particular game anyway, this win over France, Ireland was sort of back in contention for qualification for the World Cup. But in their next qualifier then against Bulgaria, again a match dogged in controversy, Ireland lost that game controversially, and that really finished Ireland's prospects of qualifying for the 1978 World Cup.
So now we come to the decade of the 1980s. And for the third straight time, the two teams were paired in a World Cup qualifying group. So for the 1982 World Cup qualifiers, France and the Republic of Ireland are in a tough group, along with Belgium, the Netherlands, and Cyprus. On October 28th, 1980, again, France hosts the Republic of Ireland at Paris. It's almost a replica of the 1976 match. France wins 2-0. Michel Platini scores in the 11th minute. Jacques Zimaco in the 77th minute. And once again, there's a controversy as Michael Robinson scored a goal that looked valid but was annulled. And the referee would later state that he had seen a handball by Stapleton in the build-up. But again, it was very similar to the previous match.
That was actually Michael Robinson's international debut as well.
At this point, you still have some of the same familiar faces, the likes of Platini, Rocheteau, Didier Six, Jean Tigana, Maxime Bossis for the French side. In the Irish camp, you have the likes of Mark Lawrenson, Kevin Moran, Chris Houghton, Liam Brady, who's at Juventus at this point, Steve Highway, Frank Stapleton, and as you mentioned, Michael Robinson making his international debut. They're managed by Owen Hand. So this match, the French win 2-0, and the return leg is in the following year on October 14th, 1981 at Dublin. In this match, the Irish win 3-2. They take the lead with an own goal in the 3rd minute. French debutant Bruno Bellon ties the match in the 9th minute, but Stapleton scores in the 23rd minute and Robinson in the 40th minute. And just before the end of the 83rd minute, Michel Platini pulls a goal back, but the Irish win. But of course, the Irish were very unlucky not to qualify despite earning 10 points in this qualifying group. It was very
Yeah.
tight. In the end, it was France and Belgium who went through.
Yeah, and without being biased or anything, Shahan, I think it's universally acknowledged that Ireland were actually robbed of World Cup qualification in this qualification campaign. Because, I mean, as we discussed in an earlier podcast, several refereeing decisions going against them.
Oh,
Both
yes, the match against Belgium too. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
the game against Belgium. The margins were so tight that, particularly in the game against Belgium, I mean, if Ireland had got a draw in that game, which they really should have, were it not for the referees to say, Ireland would have gone to the World Cup instead of Belgium. That was how tight things were. In 1980, and in this World Cup qualification campaign, I think for the first time, there was a genuine optimism and a genuine belief that this Irish team were on the cusp of achieving something big and finally making the big breakthrough in international soccer. The 1980 game, this was actually their fourth World Cup qualifier already because they'd begun with a victory over Cyprus. In September, then they had defeated the Netherlands in Lansdowne Road. 2 weeks prior to this French game, they had drawn with Belgium, again in Lansdowne Road. And of course, this game then in Paris. So, yeah, I mean, Dave Lankin actually of Derby County and later of Oxford United, he featured in this game. And when he spoke about the game in later years, he firmly believes that if Michael Robinson's goal had been given, the result in this game would have been different. In that Ireland maybe would have got a draw. And indeed, if they had that draw, they eventually would have ended up going to the World Cup, possibly instead of the French. I mean, it was an extremely tight qualifying group because in addition to France and Belgium, you also had the Dutch. So, I mean, it was a real humdinger of a qualifying group. And I think in those days it was 2 points for a win and only 2 points separated all four teams at the end of the group. So there was really only a kick of a ball between all four teams. This 1980 defeat, it was, I suppose, a hard defeat to take. But at the Republic anyway, I suppose they got their qualification campaign back on track the following year, 1981. And of course, the final game then was that game that you mentioned against France in Lansdowne Road in October of 1981. And this really, I think to this day, this has gone down as being a momentous game in Irish international soccer history, in that it was really the first time that we had beaten a major international team in a competitive game. I mean, the game was in Dublin. It was actually televised live because the game was actually a guaranteed sellout. And I mean, there was a genuine belief there that despite the setbacks that had gone against the Republic in previous games, if we had won this game in Dublin against France, we were still in with a genuine shout of World Cup qualification. So the game anyway is available on YouTube. I would recommend it for anybody who gets a chance to look at it because, I mean, from the first whistle right up to the end, it was a pulsating game. I really enjoy, even as a neutral, it was quite an enjoyable game. Of course, in 1981, of course, you had Ronnie Whelan breaking through as well. He was beginning to emerge at Liverpool also, so he had broken into the Irish international team by now. And it was a momentous victory. I mean, Ireland really stormed out of the traps. They hassled and harried the French into making, I suppose, maybe some uncharacteristic mistakes. And of course, the Lansdowne Road pitch and a raucous home support were always going to be in the Republic's favour. So, yeah, Ireland really stormed out of the blocks. They were 3-1 up at half time. As you say, Platini pulled a goal back near the end. And then right at the end, Seamus McDonough, the Irish goalkeeper, made an absolutely brilliant point-blank save from Didier Cease. Dave Langan, anyway, after the game, he thought that Michel Platini, I know he scored a goal, but he didn't really feature much in this game because the game was 100 miles an hour. And I suppose maybe, being played at a frenetic pace and the fact that Ireland were closing the French players down extremely tightly meant that Platini didn't have much of a chance to kind of get a bit of space and express his ball playing talents. This win anyway for the Republic meant that Ireland finished the World Cup qualification campaign. At this stage, they were 4 points ahead of the French, but the French still had 2 games in hand. And the key game was the following month in Paris, where France played the Netherlands. A win for either team would have put either team through to the World Cup. However, a draw in that game would have meant the Republic would have gone through to the World Cup. But as we know, France ended up winning that game 2-0, and they also won the final game against Cyprus easy enough. So France went through to the 1982 World Cup on goal difference. And remember as well, that French team, as you mentioned, they went all the way to the semi-finals of that World Cup. And Belgium, the other qualifier from in that group, done quite well at that World Cup as well. So the question was always there: if Ireland had qualified for that World Cup, how well would they have done? It's one of those what ifs. And then, of course, as well, the other thing was if Ireland had qualified for that World Cup, it would have made it extra special because Northern Ireland had also qualified. And of course, the other major question out of all of this is, and I know, as I say, we all enjoyed the wishful thinking, was that particularly at this time, if there had been a United Ireland international soccer team, that team would have been very strong indeed. Yeah, but Dave Langan said anyway afterwards, years later actually, that this failure to make this World Cup was the greatest disappointment of his international career, and I dare say the greatest international disappointment, of several other players as well. But of course, from Dave Langan's point of view, before we move away from this 1981 game, during the game, he got a knock on one of his knees. And this was an injury that he ultimately never recovered from. He was out of action for roughly 18 months and had several different knee operations. And he came back. He was with Derby County at this stage. He returned to action, played for Oxford and indeed for the Republic up to the late 1980s, but he was never quite the same player again after this injury. So this game against France, I suppose, was a key game, in his career as well. Unfortunately, for another reason, in that picking up an injury that he never really recovered from. So that really sums up, I suppose, that 82 World Cup qualification campaign. And even to this day, kind of even thinking back on it now, it still is something that is quite hard to take. But I mean, as you say, France went on from this. They became a great team, got to the semi-finals in 82, won the Euros in 84, and got to the semi-finals again in 86.
The two teams closed out the decade with a friendly on February 7th, 1989. This was a forgettable match played in the mud at Dublin at Delamount Park. We discussed this match on a podcast. Jackie
Yeah.
Charlton's managing Michel Platini has just taken over the French national team. Somewhat forgettable match.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose the only thing we can take away from that was that it was a good workout for both teams. Surprisingly, it was played in Dalymount Park, which maybe could have been maybe to do maybe with French television as much as anything, because by this stage, Ireland were playing most, if not all, of their games in Lansdowne Road, but Lansdowne Road did not have floodlights now at this stage. So maybe that was a contributing factor in the game being played in Dalymount Park. But yeah, that game was televised live, even though it was a friendly. And yeah, it was a forgettable game all round. Not helped either by it being a wet night and the poor condition of the pitch. But France, I don't know whether they were kind of going through a transitional period at this stage or not, but
Yes, they were.
France,
Yeah.
they would have used this, of course, as kind of as continuing preparation, for their own World Cup qualifiers, but they had missed out in Euro 88 and they also just missed out on the 1990 World Cup as well. So maybe they were sort of team building it by now as well.
This was a preparation for their qualifier in the following month against Scotland. So they were
Yeah.
eager to play against the British style team.
Really a forgettable game, I suppose. Little or no takeaways from it, to be honest. Only, I suppose, the international debut of Andy Townsend, and as we know, he was to become a key player for the Republic in later years. But yeah, and I mean, hard to believe that, it was all of 15 years before
Yeah.
Ireland became qualified again.
So they're in another World Cup qualifying group for the 2006 World Cup qualifiers. A lot has changed in those 15 years. France
Yeah.
became a World Cup champion and a European champion.
Ireland qualified for 3 World Cups in that period out of 4. So yeah, I mean
Yes.
Ireland had, improved as well.
At this point, France are managed by Raymond Domenech. The familiar faces include Fabien Barthez in goal, Thierry Henry, Robert Pires, Gibril Cisse, a lot of players who are familiar to the English Premier League. The Irish are managed by Brian Kerr. The familiar faces include Shay Given in goal, Roy Keane, the Manchester United captain, Robbie Keane of Tottenham, the striker, Damien Duff at Chelsea. This first match is on October 9th, 2004 at Stade de France at Saint Denis. This match ends in a scoreless tie. The Irish are able to get a result surprisingly away from home against such a good team. By the time of the second leg, the following year, on September 7th, 2005, at the Dublin at Lansdowne Road, we have to bear in mind that after the 2004 Euros, Zinedine Zidane, Claude Makelele at Chelsea, and Lilian Thuram had retired from the national team. However, in the summer of 2005, they all returned to the fold and helped France to qualify, and in fact, helped France to reach a World Cup final in the 2006 World Cup. And in the second leg, we also have Patrick Vieira back in the side, the former Arsenal midfielder who at this point had just joined Juventus. This match is remembered for Thierry Henry's goal when he lobbed the ball from outside of the box to give France a key win, and they would qualify to the 2006 World Cup. And the Irish missed out. First leg on in 2004. This was the first time since 1973 that the Irish had not lost on French soil. This match on 2005 was France's first away win since 1953.
First of all, I suppose we'll just mention that 2006 World Cup qualifying group because it did turn out to be quite a tight group because in it, as well as France and Ireland, you also had Switzerland and you also had Israel. And Israel were to prove to be a banana skin for their opponents in this group as well. But the first game in Paris that finished 0-0, Ireland had drawn in Switzerland the previous month. So there was sort of, well, maybe hope might be the wrong word, but there was maybe a tentative, genuine belief that we could actually get something out of this game in Paris. Because, you see, you have to bear in mind as well that teams that come off the back of international tournaments, like France now, for instance, who had been at Euro 2004, and indeed Switzerland, sometimes it takes a game or two for these teams, to kind of get back up to the pitch of international soccer. Because maybe teams that, qualify for tournaments and do well in them, maybe their first game immediately after these tournaments, sometimes they tend to be a little bit vulnerable. It's like as though they're kind of, I suppose maybe they've come down off a high and maybe it takes them a game or so to get back up again. So in that respect, maybe we were playing Switzerland and France at the right time in that we were getting both away matches against these teams out of the way early. And the fact as well that we went through both these games undefeated set Ireland up with, or they put him into quite a promising position to qualify. But yeah, this game against France in Paris, Ireland were generally the better team in the first half. I remember this game quite well, actually. In the second minute, actually, Clinton Morrison, who was playing for Ireland at this time, he was put through on goal, but Fabien Baptiste made a smart save. Of course, Robert Pires, he was playing for France as well in this game. He was always going to be a danger on the win. But yeah, it was really sort of, I suppose it was an evenly enough matched game for the most part in the first half. But it was more or less up and down. Quite a surprisingly open game without being too open either at the same time. But then just before half time, Clinton Morrison, who was doing quite well in this game, he suffered a knee injury, so he had to go off and he was replaced by Andy Reid. But the second half then, both teams had chances. France went close on a couple of occasions, as indeed Ireland. And the one that really sticks out for me was a chance, I think, from a free kick where John O'Shea had a free header about 20 minutes or so into the second half, and it just went narrowly wide of the goal. So if that had gone into the net, well, then who knows, Ireland may have come away from that game with a victory. But I suppose a draw was a fair result, really, because as I say, it was quite an open game. Both teams had chances, and I dare say at this point in time, the draw would have suited Ireland better in that they had gone to France and gone to Switzerland and come back from these games undefeated. So even though the group was tight, the advantage for Ireland was that they were going to play both France and Switzerland at home the following year, which would have heightened, I suppose, optimism and heightened maybe some expectations of a World Cup qualification. But I believe as well why Patrick Vieira didn't play in this match. Was he suspended? Because I remember a game around this period I'm fairly sure it was a game that involved Ireland, but I'm open to correction on this. In that, in the game previous, he'd picked up a second yellow card or something that ruled him out of a game. But
Right.
the following year, then, the following September, as you say, the return match was played in Dublin. I suppose by now, Ireland's World Cup campaign had sort of stuttered a little bit in that, in the interim, we had played Israel both home and away. We only drew both those games. And really, these were the games that ultimately cost us a qualification. In that, the away game in Israel in March of 2005, we were 1-0 up to the 93rd minute, when in fact, almost the last kick of the game, Israel scored a stoppage time equaliser. And the return of that Israel game was played in Lansdowne Road in June of 2005. Ireland went 2-0 up in that game relatively early on, and yet they were picked back in a game that became somewhat fractious to a 2-2 draw. So they were really the results that really, I won't say scuppered the promising start that Ireland had made to the World Cup qualification campaign, but it was really a setback. And as we've seen, Israel were proven to be quite a difficult team for all opposition in this group as well. So by the time this game against France anyway rolled around, Ireland basically had to get a result because they were still in a strong position in that they had 3 qualifiers left. France and Switzerland, who they were both to play at home, and Cyprus away. So they were still in a good position. So maybe assuming that they would win in Cyprus, which they did, maybe one victory against either France or Switzerland would have been enough to take Ireland through to the World Cup finals. But yeah, this game anyway, 2005 in September in Dublin, Ireland lost the game due to, I suppose, a moment of what can only be described as great individual skill by Thierry Henry, who by this stage was winning matches almost on his own, both for Arsenal and for France. It was a game that Ireland never really got going in for some reason, which was a bit surprising because when they played in Dublin, particularly in the full Lansdowne Road, they always tended to kind of start on the front foot and really have a right go at teams or whatever. But for some reason, it didn't happen in this game. Now, whether it was because of the fact that maybe, okay, France were quality opposition at that, and France really had to get a result out of this game as well for all intents and purposes. Ideally, a win, to keep alive their chances of qualification campaign. But again, it was a game of to and fro. Roy Keane featured in this game, and he was Ireland's best player. But a lot of the other Irish players, albeit they were playing against very good opposition, but I felt a lot of the Irish players just didn't really perform in this game up to the standards that we had become accustomed to them achieving. So it was really a disappointing game. One of the few home qualifiers during this period that we actually lost. Of course, I mentioned about Henry. He was at the peak of his powers for Arsenal at this time. But from an Irish point of view, this game, in hindsight, mapped the beginning of the end for Brian Kerr's management. In that, the following month then, Ireland played Switzerland, again in Lansdowne Road, in their final qualification campaign. It was a game they had to win, and the game finished scoreless. For a campaign that had started so promisingly, it really petered out, I suppose, almost tamely. Because of this, Ireland missed out. They finished 4th. Now, as I said, there was only 3 points actually separating the top 4 teams in this group. France won the group. They went through the group unbeaten. Switzerland came in 2nd. They went through the group unbeaten. Israel came 3rd on goal difference. They also went through the group unbeaten, but they didn't even get into a playoff. And we finished in 4th position, even though this game against France in Dublin was the only qualifier we had lost. But really too many draws, I think it's fair to say. With the exception of this Ireland-France game, all the other matches between Ireland, France, Switzerland and Israel, all these games in draw. So basically, all these teams were cancelling each other out. The win for France in Dublin basically put France into the World Cup and ultimately put us out. And as I say, it was the beginning of the end of, which proved to be the end subsequently of Brian Kerr's international management.
The most memorable clash between the nations would be at the end of the decade, once again with the World Cup place at stake. For the 2010 World Cup qualifiers, the sides met in a playoff home and away series to qualify for the World Cup. At this point, France are still managed by Raymond Domenech. The familiar faces include Patrice Evra, Nicolas Anelka, again Thierry Henry, among others. The Irish are managed by the legendary Italian manager Giovanni Trapattoni. And you still have the likes of Shay Given, John O'Shea, Damien Duff, Robbie Keane, among others. The two matches are played in a space of a few days in November of 2009. So the first leg is at Dublin at Croke Park on November 14th, 2009. France come away with a 1-0 away win, with Nicolas Anelka scoring in the 72nd minute. His shot was deflected by St. Ledger Hall into his own net. We come to the dramatic second leg on November 18th at Saint Denis at Stade de France. The Irish take a lead in the 33rd minute through Robbie Keane and cancel France's advantage. The match ends as a 1-0 win for the Irish, so it has to go into extra time. We come to the most talked about sequence of the match history between these nations. In the 103rd minute, Florent Malouda's long free kick from the middle of the field reached Thierry Henry on the left side at the far post. This is the days before VAR. He clearly handled the ball before he crossed it to the middle for William Gallas to score. The match ends in a 1-1 tie, and the Irish are eliminated under such circumstances. It's a match that's talked about until today. In fact, we could probably do a whole podcast just on this match alone.
Absolutely, yeah. And still quite a very sore point at this stage. I think a lot of people at this stage, even here, choose not to discuss it because it still stirs up the emotion in people. But just go back a moment, what led us here. Ireland had been in a difficult World Cup qualification group in that they had Italy and they had Bulgaria. Now, Ireland went through this World Cup group unbeaten. They drew both games against Italy, who were the world champions at the time, and they also drew both games against Bulgaria. That was enough to put the Republic through in second place in the group and into this particular playoff. Now, there was a little bit of controversy prior to the playoffs taking place in that it was believed that the draw for the playoffs, you see, you had 9 qualification groups in Europe, and it was only the best 8 runners-up went into the playoff draw to determine the final 4 teams. But there was a belief that the playoffs would be conducted on an open draw. But shortly before the playoff draw, FIFA decided at the 11th hour to introduce seeding, which meant that France were going to be seeded and Ireland weren't. So that caused a bit of, I suppose, maybe a bit of anger as well, in that it was going to make our task harder, even before the ball had been kicked in the playoffs. But draw was made anyway, and we ended up drawing France. First game in Dublin was really a game that, I suppose, really, in retrospect, if we had got something out of this game, I think even allowing for the handball incident in Paris, if we had got a result in the first leg, I think we may still have pulled through. But for some reason, we just didn't perform on the night. We had a few chances of scoring, but never really looked like scoring. And then, of course, in the second half, France, I suppose, being like all good international teams, they can kind of soak up pressure and then just maybe hit us on a counter or whatever. So it was a very disappointing result. But the fact that we had lost at home, it was our first defeat actually in this World Cup qualification campaign. And it made our task in Paris seem like almost impossible. Now, in the run-up to this game in Paris, there was also, I suppose, fear among many Republic of Ireland supporters because up to the day before the Paris game, a deal hadn't been struck for live television coverage of the game. So there was a genuine fear that, this game would not have been broadcast in Ireland. But the day prior to the match, a last minute broadcasting deal was struck, which meant that the game was televised live in Ireland. This game in Paris always sticks in my memory because we'll come to the handball in a moment, but I think in an overall sense, first of all, I think it was the finest performance Ireland put in under Giovanni Trapattoni. Because for some reason, now whether this was player driven or whether it was a change of tack by Trapattoni. Trapattoni, as you know, Shahan, he was a well-known exponent of Catenaccio. And throughout his time with the Ireland team, he always kind of tended to sort of play a safety first approach, not take risks. Not too dissimilar to the type of soccer we would have played under Jack and Mick McCarthy in later years. But for this game against France in Paris, whether it was that the players kind of decided that a change of plan was needed, or it was because of the fact that we simply had to win this game, it was really a performance sort of out of keeping with a Trapattoni team in that we really, I suppose, almost attacked the game right from the off. And we were the better team in that game in Paris. There's no doubt about that. We took a deserved lead on the half hour through Robbie Keane. It was a very actually enjoyable game to watch as a neutral. So anybody that gets the chance, I would recommend that they can look at this game on YouTube or some other platform. But we did have chances then in the second half. And had we got a second goal at that stage, that ultimately would have put us through because the away goals rule was still in operation. And if we had had a second goal, France would then have had to score two. And there would have been no extra time. So, yeah, I do recall Damien Duff actually missed a glorious chance here, early enough in the second half. And really, had that gone in, I think it's fair to say Ireland would have won that game and ended up going to the World Cup. But, yeah, I mean, one of Ireland's finest performances. The game finished 1-0 to the Republic after 90 minutes. Of course, went to extra time then. And, of course, as you know, we all know what happened. So there's no need for me to recount it here. But what I would say was that if you look once again at the lead up to the controversial Thierry Henry handball, it came from a free kick just inside the French half. Now, if you look at it again, it was something of a needless foul that Sean St. Ledger committed on a French player. In that France weren't really going anywhere as such, but Sean St. Ledger gave away what I would regard as somewhat maybe something of a needless free kick or an easy free kick to give away. And it was from that free kick that France engineered the goal or the moment of controversy or whatever you wish to call it. It was really heartbreaking. I know VAR wasn't in operation in those days, but still, I mean, it was as clear as daylight that Thierry Henry had handled the ball. So it was a cruel way to go, but I suppose it was in keeping, it was the latest, unfortunately, in what was becoming something of a long line of controversial incidents or controversial refereeing decisions that went against Ireland, particularly in games that were played in Paris. Because, I mean, in 1976, Ireland had a goal disallowed. In 1980, Ireland had a goal disallowed. And now here in 2009, France had a goal given which clearly shouldn't have been given. But it's still open to conjecture at this stage if that goal hadn't been given. I think in all likelihood the game would have gone to penalty kicks, and who would have prevailed in the penalty kicks is anyone's guess. But it did leave kind of a really bad taste in the mouth because it really felt to some people that really we should have ultimately gone to that World Cup instead of France. And of course there was to be, and then of course the aftermath too, there was a lot of to and fro. Some suggested that maybe the game should have been replayed. Others, then there was a suggestion, as put forward that Ireland be entered as a 33rd team. Something that Sepp Blatter found quite amusing. But what struck me about it was, and this became evident a few years later, was that there was no really concerted appeal made by the FAI, either to kind of maybe get the result of this game reversed. And a lot of supporters as something unusual. But it did transpire in later years, as when Sepp Blatter's term as General Secretary came to an end, it emerged that in the aftermath of this game in 2009, the FAI had been paid €5 million in compensation. but it was kept secret, and it only emerged when Sepp Blatter was forced to step down as FIFA General Secretary. So maybe a deal was obviously quietly done in the background. But still, kind of money aside, it was no substitute from taking part in the World Cup or the opportunity of taking part in the World Cup. But I suppose maybe at that time FIFA were kind of favouring the stronger teams over the weaker ones, because I suppose they wanted the stronger teams who were possible to qualify for all these international tournaments, in order to maximise television revenue and advertising and all the other paraphernalia that goes with these international tournaments. It was a disappointing end from an Irish perspective to that World Cup. Now, we did recover. We did qualify for the Euros in 2012, but missed out again for the World Cup in 2014, and that then was the end of Giovanni Trapattoni's tenure in charge of the Republic. In an overall sense, that game in Paris, I would say that and the game the previous month, the World Cup qualifying game against Italy in Croke Park, they were the two finest performances Ireland put in under Giovanni Trapattoni.
We come to the decade of the 2010s. The sides will meet twice. Now, for the first time, they will meet in the finals of an official tournament on
Yeah.
June 26, 2016, for the 2016 Euros hosted by France. They met one another at Lyon. France was managed by Didier Deschamps. The Irish are managed by the former Northern Ireland international Martin O'Neill. France would win this match 2-1. Robbie Brady had scored a penalty kick in the second minute, but France came back in the second half, and Antoine Griezmann scored twice in the 58th and the 61st minute. And later, Shane Duffy was sent off in the 66th minute, which did not help the Irish to get back in the game. The Irish were eliminated in the second round of these 2016 Euros. The next match would be a friendly for the first time since 1989 on May 28th, as France were preparing for the 2018 World Cup that they would win. They hosted the Republic of Ireland at Saint Denis at Stade de France, and they would win this match 2-0, goals by Olivier Giroud and Nabil Fekir. What stands out for this match for the Irish is that current England international Declan Rice lined up for the Irish in this friendly.
Now, this was his second game of the 3 games that he played for Ireland.
2 losses for the Irish in this decade. Finally, the last encounters between these two nations have been for the qualifiers for 2024 Euros on March 27th, 2023, at Dublin at Aviva Stadium. France came away with a 1-0 win, with Benjamin Pavard scoring in the 50th minute with a long range shot. The second leg on September 7th at Paris at Parc des Princes, France won 2-0 with Aurélien Tchouameni and Marcus Thuram scoring the goals. That has been the last matchup between the nations.
Yeah. Well, for some reason, Shahan, now I'm only speaking for myself here, but the recent games against France, I don't think any of them have really stood out. Now, I know some might say it was because Ireland lost all these games that they don't stand out, but I suppose we'll begin with that 2016 game. That was actually around, as you know, around the 16 game in the finals of the Euros that year. In some ways, that was something of a bonus game for Ireland, because we had squeaked through the group thanks to a last gasp victory against Italy, albeit a second string Italy team 4 days prior to this. So that put us into the round of 16 and this game against France. And yeah, we did start the game well. It was in our first attack, we were awarded a penalty, which Robbie Brady scored. Of course, there was a certain bit of irony in it, because the BBC coverage actually of this game, they had Thierry Henry as an analyst. And of course, the Irish penalty resulted from a handball, which, wasn't obvious kind of at first viewing, but obviously then on the replays, it picked it up. And of course, needless to say, Gary Lineker gave Thierry Henry something of a slagging over, the history of handball incidents between France and Ireland. Of course, needless to say, Thierry Henry, of course, played the classic. He kind of pretended not to know, as it were. So we held that lead anyway up to half time. But then, obviously, in the second half, two quick fire goals from Antoine Griezmann. And then, of course, coupled with the fact that Shane Duffy was sent off, that ended our Euro 2016 journey. But I think by the time 2016 rolled around, Shahan, you see, we had lost a lot of the players that would have obviously backboned us in the 2000s and maybe early 2010s. Because, Damien Duff was gone by 2016. Robbie Keane was 36. He only more or less went as a squad member, and he didn't see a moment of action in this. So, it was really the next batch of talent that was coming through. And with no disrespect to any of the Irish players at this place of time, we didn't have a great panel of quality players to choose from. The players that we had, they were all sort of maybe at sort of middling Premier League clubs, or maybe deep down, maybe into the top echelon of the Championship. We didn't have the same really strength in depth that we had in previous tournaments, particularly in the 90s and the early 2000s. So, taking that into account, I suppose it was a reasonable achievement to make the knockout stages of those Euros. And then, of course, you mentioned 2018. It was really a non-event, to be honest, because France were using that game as preparation for the 2018 World Cup, and we had missed out on qualification rather spectacularly the previous November with a 5-1 home defeat in the playoff to Denmark. And 2018, we just would have used this as a friendly. But of course, another thing that has left a bad taste in Irish mouths has been, as you know, the whole Declan Rice issue. Because what was felt at the time, you see, it wasn't so much the fact that Declan Rice subsequently declared allegiance for England. It was, you see, in the games that he played, he played 3 games for Ireland in this period in 2018. And you see, if we had known that he wasn't going to commit, Martin O'Neill by this stage had intended building the international team around Declan Rice. And an opportunity could have been given to another player in these games. It was really work that was wasted, shall we say. Playing Declan Rice, trying to build a team around him, and Declan then subsequently declared for England. So from that point of view, it has left, I suppose, something of a, well, I wouldn't say bitterness, Shahan, because every player, I suppose, has a right to choose, which international team they want to play for. But it was just more or less the manner in which it was done. You declare for a country, you play 3 games for them, and then all of a sudden you jump ship. It meant that, shall we say, the preparation work that Martin O'Neill and Roy Keane had done in these friendlies, really, with Declan Rice's defection, really went out the window, and they had to start from scratch all over again. And as it turned out, Martin wasn't to be in the job for too much longer, because a poor Nations League campaign then in the autumn of 2018 ultimately cost him his position. That was 2018. And then, of course, last year, 2023, of course, we played them again, home and away in qualifiers for the Euros. And I think we always knew at this stage that we weren't really expecting much at this stage, because we were in a group with France and the Netherlands, 2 teams to qualify. And unless we actually qualified automatically, we weren't going to be in a playoff, because we had to put in a poor Nations League qualification campaign. So what all that meant was that really, we weren't expecting much out of these games. But the game in Dublin, anyway, it was our opening qualifier. And we played quite well in that game, even though we lost the game 1-0. You may recall at the conclusion of that game, Mike Maignan had to make a brilliant save. If it scored, we obviously could have got a draw in that game. And then by the time we played France the following September, I think the qualification for us had kind
the
of
die
peaked.
was cast by then.
Yeah, the die was cast. That's it. Yeah, so that was really it. It's fair to say at the moment, and for the last few years at international level. And I suppose it just remains to be seen, whether we'll ever rise to the heady heights again. But significant is that our last 4 games against France, both competitive and friendlies, we've all lost. And our last victory, well, okay, as I say, some would say the 2009 game should have been a victory, but our last actually official victory was back in 1981, which is quite a long time.
On balance, France seems to have the upper hand. Most of the matches have been World Cup qualifiers. The only memorable match, I think it's destined to be the one on November 18th, 2009, because of the sense of injustice.
Yeah. And I would also add to that 1981 game that Ireland won 3-2, because that was really a marking point as well, in that, as I said, it was the first time in living memory that Ireland had beaten a major international soccer team in a competitive game. So, yeah, I would say the 1981 game in Dublin and the 2009 game in Paris are the two games that stand out in my memory anyway.
With that, I would like to thank you for this interview and remind everyone to please read the main blog article as well for more detail. The link is included on the video upload description, along with the respective contact information. And in addition, on the following day, I will upload the compendium with all the lineups and any available photos and videos from these matches. So, John, thank you for these continuing discussions on Irish football history.
Yeah, always a pleasure, Shahan. Always delighted to take part in them. Yeah, it's always great to, look back retrospectively over these games and discuss them.
Thank you.